It had been weeks since Nolan's breakup. The emptiness in his small, quiet house was unbearable, especially with Christmas around the corner. His friends urged him to move on, to get out there again. So, one evening, scrolling through his old matches on Tinder, he came across Kaylee. They had matched months ago but never met. Her profile seemed warm and friendly, just what he needed. Tentatively, he messaged her, and to his surprise, she replied quickly. Kaylee was enthusiastic about meeting up, and after some casual texting, she suggested a simple, festive idea, helping him decorate his Christmas tree. Nolan hesitated but figured it was harmless enough. The thought of some company sounded appealing, and he agreed. They set a date for the next evening. When Kaylee arrived, Nolan was struck by how different she seemed from her photos. Her hair was darker, her features sharper, and her smile strained. She was polite but awkward, her social cues slightly off. She wore a heavy, cloying perfume that made the air in the room feel thick. Nolan brushed it off, convincing himself it was just first meeting jitters, for both of them. They exchanged small talk while unpacking the decorations. Kaylee seemed overly interested in Nolan's life, asking personal questions about his job, his health, and his daily routine. It felt intrusive, but Nolan chalked it up to nervous curiosity. He decided to break the tension by fetching more decorations from the attic. As he climbed the creaky ladder, he noticed a faint dizziness, a wave of exhaustion he couldn't explain. Back downstairs, he handed Kaylee a box of ornaments and collapsed onto the couch, feeling unusually drained. Kaylee's voice became background noise as his eyelids grew heavier. The last thing he remembered was her standing by the tree, her figure blurred as his vision dimmed. When Nolan woke, the house was eerily silent. His head throbbed, and his limbs felt leaden. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the Christmas lights. Kaylee stood across the room, motionless, staring at him. Her silhouette was unnervingly still, her head tilted slightly as if she was studying him. "Kaylee?" he croaked, his throat dry. She didn't respond. Instead, she stepped closer, her face slipping into the dim light. There was something unsettling in her expression, a mixture of detachment and amusement. Nolan tried to sit up, but his body wouldn't cooperate. Panic surged as he realized he was paralyzed, his muscles refusing to obey. "Don't worry," she finally said, her voice calm, almost soothing. "You'll be fine. You just need to rest." His mind raced. Had she done something to him? The wine they drank flashed through his memory. Had she spiked it? Kaylee moved methodically around the room, gathering items into her bag. Nolan's eyes followed her, and he noticed what she was taking. Bottles of pills from his medicine cabinet, his vitamins, even a half-empty bottle of vodka from the kitchen counter. Why are you doing this?" he managed to whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she smiled faintly, a hollow expression that sent chills through him. Slinging her bag over her shoulder, she gave him one last look before slipping out the door, leaving it ajar. The cold night air seeped in, adding to the growing dread in Nolan's chest. He fought to move, forcing himself to roll off the couch and crawl to his phone. His fingers trembled as he dialed 911, slurring his words as he explained what had happened. The operator assured him help was on the way, but every second felt like an eternity. By the time the police arrived, Kaylee was long gone. The officer searched the house, confirming that all his medications and the vodka were missing. They took his statement, their expressions grim but unsurprised. "This isn't the first time we've seen something like this," one officer admitted. "She probably uses Tinder to find vulnerable people and steal what she can." As the reality sank in, Nolan felt a mix of fear and anger. How had he been so naive? And yet there was something deeper, an unease that lingered beyond the theft. It was her presence, her unnerving stillness in the dark. In the days that followed, Nolan couldn't shake the image of her silhouette by the Christmas tree. Every time he closed his eyes, He saw her standing there, watching him with that unnerving tilt of her head. The festive decorations felt tainted, the once cozy house now a reminder of his vulnerability. The police never caught her. Kaylee, if that was even her real name, had vanished without a trace. Nolan deleted all his dating apps and changed his locks, but the memory of that night stayed with him. A haunting reminder of how easily trust could be weaponized. And every Christmas since, he avoided putting up a tree, afraid of the shadows it might cast in the glow of its lights. The cold December night was eerily silent. In a modest house on the outskirts of town, two siblings, Eli and Rivka, sat huddled on the couch. It was Christmas Eve, 1997, but for their family, it was just another night. Their father, Dr. Weiss, was at the hospital on an overnight shift, and their mother, Miriam, was upstairs, lost in her own world of empty bottles and broken promises. At 11 and 8, Eli and Rivka were used to fending for themselves. The television flickered with a rerun of an old cartoon, casting shifting shadows across the dimly lit living room. Rivka, with her small hands clutching a pillow, turned to her older brother. "Do you think Papa will call?" she asked softly. Eli nodded. "He always calls when he can. Don't worry." His voice carried a confidence he didn't feel. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Both children froze. It was late, too late for visitors. Rivka looked at Eli, her eyes wide with fear. He gestured for her to stay put and approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" Eli called, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "Ho, ho, ho, ho," a deep voice boomed. "It's Santa Claus. I've got presents for you." Eli's heart sank. This didn't feel right. "We don't celebrate Christmas," he replied sharply, his mind racing. "Aw, come on now," the man outside said, his tone still jovial but slightly strained. "Every kid loves presents, don't they? I promise, I've got something special just for you." Eli hesitated, glancing back at Rivka. She shook her head, her small face pale. He turned back to the door. "We're Jewish. Santa doesn't visit us." There was a pause. When the man spoke again, the cheer was gone from his voice. "Just open the door, kid. I don't care if you're Jewish or not. I've got something you'll want." "No!" Eli shouted, his voice cracking. He backed away from the door, his instincts screaming that this wasn't just a confused stranger. The man's voice grew darker, angrier. "Listen, boy, open this door right now. I'm not asking again." Rivka whimpered, and Eli rushed to her side. "It's okay," he whispered, though he didn't believe it himself. He grabbed the cordless phone and dialed 911, his hands shaking. 911, what's your emergency?" the operator answered. "There's a man at our door," Eli said quickly. "He's dressed as Santa, and he's trying to get in." The operator sighed. "Kid, it's Christmas Eve. Are you sure it's not just someone playing a prank?" "It's not a prank," Eli insisted, his voice rising. "He's threatening us." "Can you see him?" "No, but," Eli began, but the operator cut him off. "Call back if something actually happens," she said dismissively before hanging up. Eli stared at the phone in disbelief, a lump forming in his throat. Rivka began to cry softly. He hugged her tightly, trying to think. Then an idea struck him. "Rivka, grab the candles," he said. She obeyed without question, handing him a box of Hanukkah candles from the shelf. Eli quickly lit one and held it under the smoke alarm. Within seconds, the high-pitched wail filled the house. The man outside began pounding on the door, shouting obscenities, but Eli didn't stop. He lit more candles, holding them up to intensify the smoke. Rivka clung to him, trembling. Minutes later, they heard the wail of sirens. Firefighters burst through the front door, their boots heavy against the hardwood floor. The man outside quickly changed his tone, shouting, "I'm their father! Let me in! My kids need me!" Eli ran to the firefighters, his voice frantic. "He's lying. That man isn't our dad. Please don't believe him." The firefighters hesitated for only a moment before one of them restrained the man. The intruder struggled, his Santa hat falling off to reveal greasy, unkempt hair. The children clung to the firefighters, their terror spilling out in choked sobs. Police arrived shortly after, and the man was hauled away, still shouting threats. One officer knelt beside Eli and Rivka, his voice gentle. "You did the right thing, kids. You're very brave." Their father rushed home as soon as he was called, gathering them both in his arms. Miriam appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale and drawn, but for once, her eyes were clear. She descended slowly, hugging her children tightly. That night, as Eli lay awake in bed, he couldn't shake the sound of the man's voice or the pounding on the door. But he also couldn't forget the moment the firefighters arrived, or the strength he'd found to protect his sister. The next day, their father sat them down and promised things would change. And for the first time, Eli believed him. In December 2022, a couple named Charlotte and her boyfriend Ewan rented a cozy, festive Airbnb tucked away in the Pocono Mountains. The photos online had promised snow-dusted pines, a roaring fireplace, and a charming cabin vibe that seemed perfect for a romantic Christmas getaway. They had been together for years, but this was their first trip in months, and they hoped it would bring them closer after the strain of a busy year. When they arrived, the cabin was everything they'd imagined. A soft layer of snow blanketed the roof, the chimney puffed out wisps of smoke, and the smell of pine filled the air. The woods surrounding the cabin were serene, their silence broken only by the crunch of snow underfoot. Inside, the host had left a handwritten note welcoming them, along with a basket of cookies and a bottle of wine. It felt almost too perfect. The first day passed like a dream. They cooked dinner together, laughed over board games, and cuddled by the fire. That night, as they settled into bed, Charlotte thought she heard faint footsteps outside, but Ewan assured her it was probably just the wind or a stray animal. She wanted to believe him, and soon, the warmth of the fire lulled her to sleep. The next morning, as they prepared breakfast, a knock came at the door. Startled, they exchanged glances. They weren't expecting anyone. Ewan opened the door to find a tall man standing on the porch, his cheeks flushed red from the cold. He introduced himself as Tom, the host's brother. Tom explained that he was checking on the property and wanted to make sure everything was satisfactory. His demeanor was friendly, almost too much so, and he casually mentioned details about their trip, how they'd arrived late in the evening and how Charlotte had struggled to carry her suitcase up the snowy steps. Charlotte stiffened. They hadn't told anyone about those details. Ewan, sensing her unease, thanked Tom and politely told him they were fine. Tom smiled, his teeth almost unnaturally white, and waved before disappearing into the woods. The rest of the day felt tense. Charlotte couldn't shake the strange encounter. "How did he know all of that?" she whispered to Ewan later. "The host might have told him," Ewan replied, though even he didn't sound convinced. They tried to brush it off, but as night fell, an unsettling sense of being watched crept over them. At midnight, they were jolted awake by loud, deliberate bangs on the front door. Ewan jumped out of bed and grabbed the nearest thing he could use as a weapon, a fireplace poker. Charlotte begged him not to open the door, but he peeked through the window. No one was there. The snow on the porch was undisturbed, as though no one had approached the cabin at all. The banging continued sporadically through the night, interspersed with the sound of faint, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. At one point, Charlotte swore she saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line watching them. She clutched Ewan's arm, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. Desperate, they contacted the Airbnb host. The host seemed confused and assured them no one named Tom was associated with the property. "Are you sure it wasn't a neighbor?" the host asked. But Charlotte's trembling voice made it clear she didn't think so. "Please lock all the doors and call the police if you feel unsafe," the host added. The couple spent the rest of the night barricaded in the bedroom, jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin. When the first light of dawn broke, they decided they couldn't stay another moment. They threw their belongings into their car and raced to leave. As they backed out of the driveway, Charlotte let out a gasp. Tom was standing at the edge of the road, his smile still plastered on his face, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his coat. He began to walk toward them. Ewan floored the accelerator and they sped away, snow spraying up behind the tires. Charlotte glanced in the rearview mirror, her stomach dropping as she saw Tom watching them disappear into the woods. Later that day, the host called back, apologizing profusely. They had no idea who the man was. The cabin had no nearby neighbors, and no one should have been on the property. "I'm so sorry this happened," the host said, their voice shaky. Even now, weeks after their escape, Charlotte and Ewan can't shake the experience. Who was Tom? What did he want? And most terrifying of all, how had he known so much about them? The town of Pine Hollow was quiet, nestled under a thick blanket of snow as Christmas approached. Arlen had recently moved there, drawn to the peacefulness of small-town life. After years of city chaos, this change felt like a gift to himself. But as Christmas Eve came, he couldn't shake the hollow feeling of spending the holidays alone. Work had kept him too busy to make friends, and the boxes he hadn't yet unpacked were a stark reminder that this place didn't quite feel like home yet. That night, Arlen stayed up late, buried in spreadsheets and deadlines. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint creaks of settling wood and the occasional howl of wind outside. He'd left the living room window slightly cracked to let in the crisp winter air, a habit he carried over from his old apartment. Around midnight, as the world seemed to hold its breath, a faint noise broke through the stillness. It was a crunching sound, like footsteps on snow. Arlen froze, his fingers hovering above the keyboard. He tilted his head, listening. The sound was distant at first, but unmistakable. Rising cautiously, he moved to the window, careful not to disturb the silence. Pulling the curtain back just an inch, he peered outside. The moonlight illuminated the snow-covered yard, and there they were, footprints. The trail started from the driveway, meandered to his front porch, and then back the way they'd come. His breath fogged the glass as his mind raced. It could have been a neighbor, maybe a carol singer who'd decided against knocking. Still, something about the sight unsettled him. He checked the locks on his door twice before heading to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. When Christmas morning arrived, Arlen felt strangely detached. The holiday spirit seemed to skip over his home entirely. He tried to distract himself with movies and a few calls to old friends, but the unease from the night before lingered. As darkness fell, he decided to call it an early night, but the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder. Arlen sat on the couch, the TV casting flickering shadows across the walls, and strained to hear through the muffled sound of his heartbeat. The crunching snow was closer now, deliberate and slow. Grabbing his phone, he approached the window, but as he reached to pull the curtain aside, the sound stopped. Dead silence. He hesitated for a moment before finally peeking out. The footprints were back, identical to the ones from the previous night. A perfect trail to his front door and back. But there was something else now. The footprints were closer together, as though whoever made them had stood in place for a while. Watching. A shiver ran down Arlen's spine. After what felt like hours, he forced himself to relax. He locked up once more, grabbed a blanket, and settled on the couch, determined to get some sleep. The dim light of the TV and the warmth of the fire lulled him into a restless doze. But when he woke, it wasn't the morning light that greeted him. It was the wet footprints. They started in his bedroom, by the window he'd left cracked open for fresh air. The snow outside was undisturbed, but inside, the trail was clear. The prints were smeared and damp, weaving through his home. They led from the bedroom to the hallway, into the kitchen, and then toward the living room where they suddenly stopped. Arlen's breath caught in his throat as he followed the trail, his heart hammering so hard it drowned out every other sound. He checked the locks on the doors and windows. They were all secure. The front door had never been opened. Yet someone had been inside. His chest tightened as the realization sank in. They had been in his house while he slept, moving silently just a room away. When the police arrived, they inspected the footprints carefully. Their theory was straightforward, almost dismissive. The intruder had likely scouted the house the night before, assuming it was empty. The cracked window had made entry easy, and the person must have slipped out without disturbing the snow. But there was one thing that didn't sit right with Arlen. If they had left the same way they came, why were there no footprints leading away from the house? The officer chalked it up to paranoia and the snow-covering tracks, but Arlen couldn't shake the gnawing dread. That night, he sealed every window and double-checked every lock. He sat in the living room, clutching a kitchen knife, the flickering fire his only company. Every creak of the house felt louder, every shadow sharper. When sleep finally claimed him, it came fitfully, haunted by the thought that whoever had walked those footprints hadn't needed to leave. They were still inside.